Amen. So, I'm smiling because of the joy of salvation, but this video isn't um, on a good thing. This is on exposing evil. And actually, such a grave evil has entered in to the country of Ireland that it is blatantly treasonous. Now, they really are insulting our intelligence at this stage. Like, we're not stupid. We understand the definitions of terminologies, the proper use of words. As a nation, we're relatively well educated to a decent standard, even if you just do secondary school. So that we're not easily deceived. So when you think about a recently used term by the Court of Appeal in Ireland, now that's one of the three highest courts in the land. You have the High Court, the Supreme Court, and the Court of Appeal. Well, the Court of Appeal is the court you go to when you're appealing something in the High Court. So obviously then, therefore, it has a higher distribution of authority than the High Court in certain ways, or in certain implementations, jurisdictions. So the term that I want to expose is the term presumptively constitutional. Let's look at the fundamentals of that term and expose why it is absolutely moronic and treasonous. It is moronic because it is contradictory. It is a contradiction in terms. Something being presumptively something means that you're presuming it to be. To presume is an interchangeable term with the term to assume. So the only reason you'd be presuming or assuming something is because you don't have evidence to confirm it as such. So when they say that we're presuming something constitutional, they're lying to us because they're saying that there isn't evidence to show whether it is or it isn't constitutional. And that's the same as saying there is no written law in Ireland, when there is, because the term constitution is just another term for written law. And you can't have it written down and not know what it is. That's preposterous. So they're really taking the mick now. The term presumptively constitutional is treason. The Court of Appeal in Ireland using that term is treason, because the higher court's responsibility is to ensure that the constitution of this land is being implemented and upheld in the courts of this land, so that the High Court, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeal, the seat of President, or the jurisdiction of any presiding judge must submit to the constitution of this land, uphold it and maintain it. So the fact that any of those courts would be saying we don't have evidence as to what the constitution is treason. You cannot be upholding the constitution of this land and inviting the citizens of the country to remain in ignorance as to what the constitution is. Because when you say presume this constitutional, or this is presumptively constitutional, which is the terminology used, you're effectively saying remain in ignorance as to whether this is constitutional or not. And if you are a judge of the High Court of Ireland inviting people to remain in ignorance as to what the law is, you yourself are breaking it. Because it is your job, duty and role to uphold it. So it should never be a position that you're holding to incite ignorance as to what it is, or even claim that there's no evidence as to whether a legislation is constitutional or not. That's a lie. So again, to presume something is to claim that there's a lack of evidence to confirm it or deny it, to assume something is the same. So presumptively constitutional is saying we don't have evidence to determine whether this legislation is constitutional or not. And that's a lie. If they're saying we do have evidence, but we're not going to confirm it or deny it, then they're failing in their office and inciting willful ignorance of the people. So they're inciting and inviting crime. The term presumptively constitutional is treasonous. Anybody who uses it, anybody who writes it, anybody who claims that it is an extant authority or mechanism or hinge point within our courts is committing treason. Therefore, the 3 judges of the Court of Appeal in Ireland who said that we must presume sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006 constitutional broke their oath of office, committed treason in the highest courts of this land, and are now inciting members of the Irish public who have sought the testing of the constitutionality of the sections they say are presumptively constitutional, are facilitating the failure of Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan of the High Court to carry out that task by saying that we must remain in ignorance and presume something constitutional, when in fact we have evidence to confirm or deny it as constitutional. The term presumptively constitutional assumes that we don't have evidence to confirm or deny whether something is constitutional or not, because it's saying we must presume it to be so. Now, if you have evidence to the contrary, that a legislature is in fact unconstitutional, and you are inciting people to remain in ignorance as to whether it is or it isn't, or you're just failing in your office to carry out the test of the constitutionality of it, then you are inciting crime in this country and you are committing high treason. We now have a President, Michael D. Higgins, who is inciting crime in this country by way of enacting legislations which he doesn't test before the Supreme Court for their constitutionality prior to enacting them. We have a judge of the High Court of Ireland, Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan, who is failing in her office to complete the testing of sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006, which she was tasked with so doing in 2022, where it was number 1 on the schedule of her court. She completed the case without completing the test and gave no reason as to why she failed to do her job as a High Court judge. There was then an appeal put in, and the Court of Appeal reaffirmed the order that Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan made, in the way of saying that I was wrongfully imprisoned for a month and had my liberties reduced for 2 years wrongfully. By the way, Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan failed to make restitution or compensate me in any manner, whilst she continued to abandon the task of testing the constitutionality of the sections that court was brought together so to test. Well, she failed to do that. The state tried to overturn her ruling on the dropping of all charges against me in the way of the imprisonment and the reduction of liberties. And she failed to make compensation, failed to make restitution, but the state continued to try and have them overturned. Now, the Court of Appeal found that they shouldn't be overthrown and threw out the case and said in its ruling that we must presume the sections 115 and 117 constitutional. This is treason. They had evidence that injustices had been perpetrated against me by the state and failed to make a compensation order and a restitution order, while they actually gave me €150 for my court costs. Are they claiming that that's the only cost I incurred as a result of the month's imprisonment or the 2 years reduction of liberty? Because that's what they were called together to address. They claimed I was due costs, but didn't make restitution or compensation for the ruling they reaffirmed, while they committed treason in telling us to presume things constitutional, which were in fact unconstitutional, and continued to neglect the testing of them, even though they were brought together to complete and revisit the case. And when they revisit a case, they have to revisit it as though they're addressing it afresh. They have to look at the schedule again, and they didn't. They said, we must presume these constitutional. They didn't complete the task either, and they had an opportunity to do so. They're not allowed agree with Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan partially and then disagree with her partially. You know, in one sense, what I mean by that is they're not only allowed to revisit her ruling in its parts, they have to revisit it in its entirety. So they have to look at each part of the schedule individually, and they didn't. They just said we have to presume constitutional, what they again failed to test the constitutionality of. So that's highly suspect. Why would they continue again as the Court of Appeal to test the constitutionality of something that had been set before the High Court for testing? That's highly suspect. And then tell us that we must presume it's constitutional. Oh, we're not going to test it. Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan didn't test it. We're not going to test it again. But you have to presume it's constitutional. Thank you, that'll be all. Give that man €150 in a few weeks. Presumptively constitutional is treason. We have evidence as to what is constitutional and what isn't. Nothing is presumptively constitutional. Nothing, absolutely nothing, can be left by our High Court and our Court of Appeal as presumptively constitutional. Or our President, for that matter. They are tasked with upholding the Constitution of the land. It's their primary objective as the government. So the fact that they would even shelve it for later on down the line after they enact something is treason. Because they're entertaining the idea and the fact that it may be unconstitutional, and they're just doing nothing about it. Presumptively constitutional says we don't have evidence to determine whether this is constitutional or not. That's a lie. It's an absolute blatant lie. Because the very word constitution means written law. How can you have no evidence if it's written down? So they're blatantly, barefaced, insulting our intelligence and lying to us about the meaning of the term constitutional. Nothing, absolutely nothing is presumptively constitutional. It's either constitutional or it isn't. And it's their job to determine that, not to leave ambiguity surrounding it. Treason. And we have names. Michael D. Higgins, Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan, and those three judges of the Court of Appeal that ruled something that was tasked, that the High Court was tasked with testing, which they failed to carry out the test and complete the test of the constitutionality of sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006, which are actually telling guards they can prosecute in court when the High Court is telling them they can't. Which came then again before the Court of Appeal for testing, and they failed to test it, saying that we should presume it constitutional. So that's two of the highest courts of this land leaving a legislature in place claiming it's presumptively constitutional when both of them were tasked with getting to the bottom of whether it was constitutional or not. Both of them. Because when an appeal goes in, the entire schedule is appealed and must be revisited. So for them to leave sections 115 and 117 of the Criminal Justice Act 2006 with ambiguity surrounding them is treason. The term presumptively constitutional is a contradiction in terms. Nothing's presumptively constitutional because there's evidence whether it is or it isn't. Do you know what I'm saying? Presumptively says you don't have evidence, but we do. So that term in and of itself is just a lie. It's a treason. Because we have evidence. The word constitution means written law. You can't have the written law and no evidence of it. Is it written down? Yeah. Is that evidence? Yeah. So why is it presumptively? It's not. They're lying to you. It's not presumptively constitutional. It either is or it isn't constitutional. It's not presumptively constitutional. They're inviting you to commit treason with them and remain in ignorance. The only reason anybody would do that is because they know that it's not lawful and they don't want to be exposed for legislating unlawful things. That's the only reason anybody would do it, is to conceal their crimes. So of course, if they're all in it together and conspiring together, they're going to be covering for each other. So they come up with these terms that are nonsense. And the thing about this term is, this actually exposes them. Because the very term itself is treason. Because it's a lie. Nothing, and it betrays the rights of the people. And it betrays the constitution of the land. By allowing legislations to be in existence, which they are confessing may or may not be constitutional. No, they're either constitutional or they're not, and it's their job to ensure that legislature is constitutional. So the fact that they would use the term presumptively means they're saying we're not going to check. Then they're committing treason. The fact that they would say it remains an open question as to whether 115 and 117 are constitutional or not. No, it doesn't. It doesn't remain an open question. It either is constitutional or it isn't. What they're saying is, we haven't bothered to check and don't intend to. We're not motioning towards doing so. That's treason, because it's their job to remove all ambiguity as to what's lawful and what isn't, according to the Constitution of Ireland. Presumptively constitutional is treason. They're fighting against your constitution right before you, and under threat and duress of imprisonment, are inciting you to conspire with them. It's very different if you say to somebody, this one needs testing, then this one is presumptively constitutional. They're two different things, aren't they? One asks you to go on obeying it indefinitely. The other says we've motioned to check this and we're going to test it on such and such a date. Well, we were doing that. Years passed, they started the court case and then abandoned the test. That's treason. No reason given. That's treason. Miss Justice Siobhan Phelan of the High Court of Ireland committed treason. The term presumptively constitutional is treason. Therefore, the three judges of the Court of Appeal have committed treason. No, that term is in the legislature. Oh, is it? Who put it there? Is it constitutional? It can't be, because it allows something to remain that isn't constitutional. Therefore, it can't be constitutional. Therefore, you're committing treason because you know that that term is treasonous, because you know that that term allows ambiguity around what's constitutional and what isn't. That's not upholding the Constitution. Presumptively constitutional says we do not have evidence as to what is constitutional. That's a lie. The Constitution is the evidence. It is the written law. Do you see how that term is a contradiction in terms? Presumptively unconstitutional. No evidence of what's evidenced. It's a contradiction in terms. It's a treason. Blessings in Jesus' name. Your government are now conspiring to treason on an ongoing basis and committing treason. And I've told you the mechanism they're now using to try and blur over that, smudge over it and keep it out of under your radar and out of your detection. Treason is afoot, aplenty, in the highest courts of this land and in the highest offices. Seat of President, legislator, High Court judge, Court of Appeal judges. The only one that haven't had this before them is the Supreme Court. And you know what? They are the ones who should have prevented it ever coming into existence at the time when President Higgins was actually considering it for addition to the legislature. So they conspired with him. Because at that point, they're supposed to make sure that nothing gets into the legislature which is unconstitutional. They're now telling the president he doesn't have to bring it before them if he doesn't want to. What? Who legislated that? Is that constitutional? How can it be constitutional that they be telling the president he doesn't have to check something against the Constitution? This is treason afoot, aplenty. Treason all over the place. Presumptively constitutional is treason and should be removed with immediate effect. And all of the harm that has arisen as a result of it compensated for and restitution made to the individuals negatively affected by way of legislations which have come into effect on foot of that term. And legislations that have been allowed to persist as presumptively constitutional. Which means, and they're confessing, they may be encouraging something to exist which isn't constitutional. Because they brought it for testing. So they've entertained that it might not be constitutional and have left it like that by way of that treasonous term. Blessings in Jesus' name. They're breaking the law left, right and centre, writing legislations which fight against your constitution. Ireland is under attack systemically by individuals who, some of which are known Freemasons, probably they all are Freemasons, but are conspiring together now and publicly to commit treason by way of basically nonsensical and self-refuting terms. Blessings in Jesus' name.